Throughout the course of music history, genres have come, gone, left their mark, and been written about in various theory and history textbooks, except a few. Some genres appear briefly and then disappear into the void, never to be heard about again. These certain lost genres are rarely written about theoretically, culturally, or historically, and thus their influence is incredibly limited. And what better place to start this series than with the obscurest of obscure genres, the 1950s lounge style known as Exotica. As I mentioned at the top of the video, Exotica is extremely lost. I've never heard any other musician mention it. I've never heard any musician I admire claim it as an influence, and I've certainly never seen it written about in any theory textbooks I studied in school. The only reason I'm familiar with the genre of Exotica is because Brian Wilson of the Beach Boys was asked in a 2017 interview if it had any influence on Pet Sounds and the Subsequent Smile, to which he denied. From this interview, I ended up going back and looking into what exactly Exotica was, and honestly, when I went back and listened to some classic Exotica albums, I was intrigued with what I heard. The origins of Exotica are not exactly agreed upon by the few music historians who study the genre, but it's generally thought the 1951 album The Ritual of the Savage, or Le Sacre des Sauvages, by Les Baxter, is often noted as the starting point of the genre. It was the first album to mix Latin rhythms, Debussy-esque harmony, and jazz forms together in the service of creating a concept and evoking the sights and sounds of the jungles of Polynesia or Africa. Les Baxter is an interesting character. When he was young, he was a singer with Mel Torme's Meltones, and in 1947 he actually recorded the highest-selling theremin album to date, entitled Man of the Moon Music. It was this familiarity with experimental music that gave Les Baxter the idea of mixing various genres together to create something new. Following the release of The Ritual of the Savage, the genre of Exotica gained popularity among a certain subset of older Americans who had served overseas in the South Pacific theater of war during World War II. It's interesting to note that though Exotica was contemporaneous with early rock and roll like Elvis and Chuck Berry, it's one of the few times in contemporary modern American music history when a specific genre was cultivated and marketed specifically to an older adult audience. And as far as I know, it's the last time the American record industry made a concerted push to market a genre that was not remotely targeted towards anyone under the age of 40. While Les Baxter was the originator of the Exotica genre, it was another man who gave the genre its name and boosted its popularity to mainstream appeal. That man was Martin Denny. His 1957 album, entitled Exotica, broke the genre into the mainstream. The single, Quiet Village, reached number 2 in the pop charts in 1959 and elevated Exotica to its highest point of popularity. Baxter was certainly an influence on Denny. In fact, Quiet Village is a Les Baxter composition from the seminal Ritual of the Savage album. What was different was the introduction of the vibraphone replacing the strings to give the music a more Polynesian feel. Second, real or sampled animal sounds or found sounds from the jungle. Third was the introduction of stereophonic recording. With the introduction of stereo recording, the ability to really evoke the sounds of the jungle with the aforementioned animal noises took on a much more dynamic presentation than had they been recorded in mono. This was what really made Martin Denny the king of Exotica overall, and he did end up selling the most records out of any Exotica artist. In addition to Martin Denny and Les Baxter, there were other proponents of the genre. The first is Juan Esquivel. Now, his music is interesting in that it is technically classified as Exotica music, but he was more a proponent of a cousin genre known as space age pop. Space age pop shared a lot of similarities with Exotica, but there was more of an emphasis on the moon, outer space, the stars, and a de-emphasis of Southeast Asian instruments in favor of more traditional ensembles including strings, brass, woodwinds, etc. In addition to Juan Esquivel, there was Arthur Lyman. Originally, he was actually Martin Denny's vibraphone player before he left to pursue his own solo career within the Exotica style. His albums are great too. They're not as well known and they pretty much stick to the formula of Exotica that Denny had developed, but there's still a lot of quality stuff. But what of the actual music of Exotica, the theoretical and analytical aspects of it? Well, I find the genre very interesting because it's an eclectic mix of so many different styles of music that came together briefly, and then, as far as I can tell, no one ever touched on this again, really, with a few exceptions I'll get to later. First, the rhythm. Most Exotica pieces are powered by a Latin or Afro-Cuban groove. There's often a prominent clave, though not all the time. Second, the harmony. I would describe the harmony of Exotica as a mix between, again, Latin jazz and Debussy. Oftentimes, the harmonic structure of the songs will mix traditional jazz changes with sections purely based around the whole tone scale. In fact, I would say, aside from jazz and Latin music, it's the intense influence of Debussy that separates Exotica away from jazz as a genre. Just take a listen to the Sirens movement of Debussy's Nocturnes and compare it with the piece Jungle Madness from Martin Denny's Hypnotique album. As you can see, very similar with the use of voices and instrumentation as well. And let's talk about the instrumentation. Again, one of the things that I think separates Exotica from something like jazz is the incorporation and emphasis on the vibraphone. Instruments like the Japanese koto, the Chinese bell tree, the rain stick, the Indonesian and Burmese gongs, as well as various Polynesian chimes, gave the music its own distinct feel away from anything else. As far as I can tell, I'm classifying this as a lost genre and including it in this series because after 1962, the influence, the presence of Exotica music basically fell off the face of the earth. One of the main reasons for this might be, as I mentioned earlier, Exotica was an adult genre of music. It was marketed mostly to adult servicemen who had served in the South Pacific Theater of War during World War II. In contrast to rock and roll, which was being created at roughly the same time, it was the anti-counterculture music. It was made for suburban men, steady income, a wife, a few kids, a job. It was not exactly getting into the ears of young musicians eager to make their mark on the world, with two notable exceptions. The first is the man I mentioned earlier in this video that made me aware of the existence of the genre, Brian Wilson of the Beach Boys. Now, for the record, Brian Wilson says he was not influenced by the Exotica genre and didn't even know who Martin Denny or Les Baxter was. But if you listen to Pet Sounds and Smile, the influence to me is apparent. Take Pet Sounds. The song Caroline No. While the harpsichord does put it in mid-60s Baroque pop style, if you listen closely, the emphasis of the vibraphone, the slow tempo, and subtle understated Latin rhythm, to me, evokes the sounds of a mid-50s Les Baxter record. And the instrumental, Pet Sounds, off of Pet Sounds, is categorized on Wikipedia as Exotica. Now, on Pet Sounds, it's debatable, but listening to the Smile sessions, which is basically accepted, at least by me, to be the closest approximation of the Smile album, there are numerous instrumental sections throughout Smile that emphasize the vibraphones heavily, including the songs Wind Chimes, Love to Say Data, and especially the tune Holiday, which definitely to me feels like a Martin Denny number. Had Smile been released in 1967, perhaps the Exotica genre would have seen influence among a younger generation, but it was not to be. The only other prominent musician that I would say had some Exotica influence would have to be Frank Zappa. Anyone who's listened to a Frank Zappa record knows there's vibraphones all over the place, and Frank Zappa is well known as an eclectic musician. And throughout multiple points on the Apostrophe or Grand Wazoo album or One Size Fits All, there are hints of that Latin Debussy vibraphone sound throughout. Of course, it's tempered by Frank's sense of humor and emphasis on technicality, so I can't say it's a direct influence like I can with Brian Wilson. But other than those two musicians, the influence of Exotica appears to have completely disappeared from the musical landscape. There was a slight revival in the mid-90s as a bunch of hipsters thought it was really cool to put tikis everywhere and select these albums based on how strange some of their album covers were. And Juan Esquivel did see a slight resurgence of his career at this time and even released a new album that sold pretty well. But other than, like I said, Brian Wilson, Frank Zappa to an extent, and the 90s lounge revival movement that lasted a few years, this genre has mostly disappeared into the ether. In conclusion, Exotica is actually a really cool genre of music. The harmonic framework is very unique, the Debussy plus Latin jazz thing. The instrumentation is lush, colorful, with a very diverse palette, and yeah, it's a vibe, basically, if I could sum it up in one word. Also, I mentioned it briefly earlier in this video, but I wanted to touch on the space age pop genre, which is considered the little cousin of Exotica. There's a few albums in this style that are very good, but Les Baxter's Space Escapade, which has by far one of the greatest album covers of all time, is the one you definitely have to check out. There's a few albums I would recommend to get started, like this one, and maybe this one. I wanted to feature Exotica on the first episode of this series because it is a genre that should no longer be lost.